You continue the relationship between Havdalah on the cup of wine and Havdalah during davening. When we learned the mitzvah of Kiddush, we discussed whether we learned there that you have to that Kiddush really is anything that commemorate, right? We didn't think of a better word than commemorates, right? Yaakov, you tried to help me here with this. That helps us appreciate, to give credence to whatever it is, the Kiddush and the Kedusha of Shabbos. And Chazal instituted the mitzvah of Kiddush to be davka on wine, and therefore when we make the mitzvah, when we make Kiddush during davening, maybe either we're Yotzei during davening and then we do it again on wine to do the Takat Chachamim, or possibly we have kavanah to not be Yotzei until we make the Kiddush on the cup. Havdalah seems to be a slightly different story. We're going to try to see the relationship between three different things. There are three things that are commonly known about Havdalah, three ways in which Havdalah can be made. One way is by saying Baruch HaMavdil B'Kodesh L'Chol, which allows us to do melacha, but doesn't necessarily fulfill all the Havdalah aspects that we learned last time. Better. That's one. The second is during davening in the bracha of Ata Chonan Adam Dat, we add Ata Chonan Tanu to do Havdalah. And the third is on the cup that we say Baruch Regefen, and then we say Mavdil B'Kodesh L'Chol, etc. So the Gemara in Brachot Lamed Gimel says the following: Amar Rav Shemen bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan, Michdi Anshe Knesset Hagedolah tiknu lehem liYisrael brachot utfilot kedushot ve'havdalot. Where's the right time to do any of these? Brachot, tefilot, kedushot, and havdalot. The one that interests us, of course, is havdalot. Amar li batchila kvoa batfila, he'eshiru kvoa al hakos, he'inu chazru kvoa batfila, ve'hem amru amavdil batfila tzar she'avdil al hakos. So, initially, it was instituted to do during davening. Then they said, well, people can afford to have another bracha on the cup of wine, to spend another cup of wine on another mitzvah. So it's better to have a kos shel bracha and do it on that. Shiur, they got richer, do it on the kos. Elamai, then they got poor again. They realized this is too much. This is too much. I just realized that. Sorry, something here is bothering me. They realized that it's a burden. So they decided you can do it doing davening, and that's it. And eventually they said you should do it twice. You should really do it twice. So if you have to choose one, it's better to do it during davening. But the right thing to do is both. Beseder. Now, since we have two opportunities to make Havdalah, it's preferable to do it. If you have to choose one, it's preferable to do it in davening, but you could do it on the cup. And therefore, if you forget to do it during davening, there's no problem to make it up later on. That's the Gemara says over here. If you forget to say, so you have to repeat the davening. You have to go back to that bracha because that's a vital part of the bracha. But Havdalah during Chonan Adat, you don't. Why not? The question here is, what happens if you don't have the opportunity to say it on the Kiddush cup, on the Havdalah cup, obviously? I mean, the question is how to read this Braita. And the Braita says, if you forget Havdalah b'chonan adat, you don't have to repeat. Why not? So the wording of the Gemara here is, you are able to say it on a cup instead, and therefore saying it during davening is not critical. That's what it sounds like. So I daven Ma'ariv. So here's the question. I daven Ma'ariv and I forgot to say Atachon Antanu. I daven Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbat. I forgot to say Atachon Antanu. What do I do now? So I can, so there are two ways of looking at this. One way is to say, well, go home and make Havdalah on the cup of wine and fine, right? And then that's why I don't have to repeat davening. But that's not what the Braita seems to imply. The Braita seems to say, since it was instituted both on the cup and during davening, so if you miss out on that, so they never defined forgetting Atachon Antanu during davening as something that you need to repeat. When they first instituted it during davening, when they reinstituted during davening, right? As we saw in the Gemara here, they reinstituted back into davening, and then they said, well, now you have two options, and really you should do both, right? You should do it during davening, you should do it on the cup. Therefore, when we say make Havdalah during davening, but if you forget, don't worry about it. Why not? Because you can do it on your cup. Now, what happens if you don't have a cup? Right? Those are there are two ways of looking at this. You can say this is a part of davening that was never meant to, that if you forget, you never need to repeat. Or you can say this is a part of davening that you have another way of making up. I'll give you an example. If a person forgets Al Nisim, what do we do if we forget Al Nisim during davening? We don't repeat. Chazal decided it's not a critical enough part of davening that if you forget Al Nisim during davening on Chanukah, you don't need to repeat your davening. You don't need to go back to that bracha. It's not important enough to repeat. So there are certain parts of davening that if you forget, right, let's take Aseret Yemei Teshuvah as the classic, right? If you forget, if you forget the things we add during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, right? If you forget, we don't have to repeat that bracha, right? You don't go back to a tagibo. Why not? Because Chazal decided it's not critical enough. But if you say Baruch Atah Hashem Ha'el HaKadosh instead of HaMelech HaKadosh, you do have to repeat because that changes the bracha itself. Now, what about Atachon Antanu during davening? Is that a vital part of davening or not? So what it says in the Braita is, since you say it on the cup, it wasn't instituted as a vital part of davening. And therefore, if you forget it, you don't need to repeat. Now, you might ask, okay, this sounds like a bit of a pilpul. Why is this bothering you so much? The answer is that, why is this bothering me? The question is this: what happens if I don't have wine at home? What happens if I don't have the opportunity to make the bracha later on? I won't be able to make Havdalah on a cup of wine. So if I forget it during davening, we say, okay, fine, go home and make Havdalah then. But what happens if I daven Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbat, I forgot to say Atachon Antanu, and then I realize I don't have, in the army, in the middle of nowhere, and I don't have anything to make Havdalah on. What do I do now? Do I now need to repeat davening since I don't have the opportunity? So those are the two ways to read this Braita. One way says you can say it on the cup, and therefore it was never instituted as something that needs to be repeated. And then even if you don't have the cup, it was never instituted as something that needs to be repeated. That's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is, since you could make it up at home on your Havdalah cup, you don't need to repeat. But if you can't, you do. So that's the Gemara's debate. The Gemara says over here, lo teima, you don't necessarily read this as since you have the possibility of doing it on the cup. Since you actually make Havdalah on your cup, then right, since you actually do say it on the cup, you don't need to repeat. What's the nafkamina between this reading and this reading? If you read it in that means we never instituted it as something you need to repeat, since you can say it on the cup, since you can alternatively say it on the cup. But if you say that means if you say it on your cup, then you don't need to repeat, and if you don't, then you do. And then we're going to see the Rishonim discuss how far do we go with having to repeat it if you forget it during davening, and then can't necessarily repeat it, say it as a separate bracha on the cup. Which is really our question. was ta'a b'zo v'zo. We're going to see the Rishonim argue what does ta'a b'zo v'zo mean exactly. Amali ta'a b'zo v'zo chazer l'rosh. The question is, so then you do have to repeat davening. The Gemara's bottom line is there are situations in which you won't say Havdalah properly in davening or on the cup, and then you really will have to repeat your davening. The question is, what is that situation? So that is a machloket. The Meiri says like this. Interesting explanation. Because the wording, why is there going to be such a machloket? Because the wording ta'a b'zo v'zo is a bit strange. I understand how you make a mistake during davening. Okay, you don't concentrate. This is one of the great proofs that Chazal appreciate how human we are, right? It's one of the great halachot. A person who finishes his Rosh Chodesh davening and doesn't know if he said Ya'aleh v'yavo. He doesn't know if he said Ya'aleh v'yavo. Said, hold on. You're standing in front of Kadosh Baruch Hu and talking to him, and you have no idea what you said? Nagid, you forgot to say something, but you don't even know if you said it or not. That's pretty astonishing, right? So, but it appreciates the Chazal understand our humanity, that we're humans, that sometimes you're saying
never occurred to anyone here.
Khalila, no one in this year, obviously. But right, Chazal appreciate our humanity and say, sometimes you'll be on autopilot and just I'm not saying that you forget something during davening. You don't even know if you said it at all, right? You don't even know if you said it. So ta'a during davening we understand, but ta'a of Havdalah is a bit strange. What do you mean ta'a? You don't have the cup. You don't. Well, what is the mistake in Havdalah on the cup? You say Bore Gefen and Bore Mine Besamim and Bore Mine Morehesh and forget to say Havdalah. Right? What could the ta'ut be? What does that mean? What mistake could you make on the kos? Right? It's a bit of a strange wording, right? And that's why there's a machloket between the Rishonim what this means. So the Meiri says, Ta b'zo v'zo means shitpalel v'shachach, b'nizkar, during davening, v'samach al shel kos, v'nimtza she'en lo kos. Right? In other words, you start davening on autopilot, like most of us do, let's be honest. You get Tatachon Adam Dat and go through a Tachonet and reach the next bracha. You get to the middle of Vidu Yerushalayim Yircha and you say, oh wait, I forgot Tatachon Antanu. Well, I could make it up in Shema Koleinu. But the truth is I don't need to make it up in Shema Koleinu because I'm just going to make Havdalah on my cup of wine at home. You finish davening and you say, wait, I'm not at home. I'm in Miluim, I'm in the middle of nowhere, I don't have wine. Whoops. That's the ta'ah. The ta'ah is that he assumed he'll be able to say make Havdalah on the wine at home, but actually he can't. Right now it sounds a bit like this, but again, the Meiri is trying to understand what ta'ah on the wine can it be. What it means ultimately is, and there's what he says over here, Inyan ha'she'ela mi'amrinan ho'il ve'en lo kos chozer u'mitpalel o dilma ho'il ve'idchi al smach ha'kos she'nimtza she'en lo idchi. He says like this. If you don't have a cup of wine, obviously you should daven again, because that's the bottom line in the Gemara. That seems to be the bottom line in the Gemara anyway, right? That seems to be what the Gemara says over here already. If you say it on the Havdalah cup, then you don't have to repeat davening. But if you don't, so you do need to repeat the davening. Okay. But what happens if you justifiably chose to not say Havdalah on the cup, Havdalah during davening? Why? Because you were saying Havdalah, because you were saying Atachon Adam Dat and you forgot. Fine. You get to Shema Koleinu, you say, oh, should I repeat it? No, I'll say it on the Kiddush one, on the Havdalah cup, right? I'll say it on my cup. And you say, oh, you think you have a cup? Fine. So you skipped it on purpose, right? In that case, would that be different than stam forgetting it during davening, since you chose? Now, it's a bit like this, and it's not surprising that the bottom line is, but the reason the Meiri is bending over backwards is because he wants to fit the words ta'a b'zo v'zo into this scenario. The important thing, as far as we're concerned, to this Meiri is, if you didn't daven Atachon Antanu, and you don't have Havdalah cup, it's very clear that no matter what, you have to daven again. So the fact that we don't need to repeat Atachon Antanu is only because we know we're going to make Havdalah on a cup later on. But if you can't, even in this more interesting scenario he presented, you'd have to repeat davening. The Rosh and the Rashba say a more surprising situation. He ate before Havdalah. I'll explain what that means. It means the following. You're not allowed to eat until you make Havdalah. Now, the Gemara in Pesachim asks, if you forget and you eat before Havdalah, or you purposely eat before Havdalah, is there a knas? Do we say, well, now you've disqualified your Havdalah. You can't make Havdalah now because we told you to make Havdalah before you eat. And you ate first. So you disqualified your Havdalah. The Gemara's answer is, no, you do make Havdalah. Even if ta'am, you still make Havdalah. You made a mistake, you make Havdalah. Says the Rosh, if you ate before Havdalah, but you also didn't say atachon and tanu, then you have to say then you have to repeat the davening again. Ta'abezo v'zo means you made two mistakes. One mistake is you didn't have tachon and tanu. Second mistake, you ate before Havdalah, 2 strikes, you're out, you have to go back to the beginning and repeat davening. Then you do have to repeat and daven again. Now, the Rashba has a more interesting, scenario. Ta'abezo v'zo parush kigon deloi shelo yivdil batfilah ve'achal o asa melacha kodem sheyivdil al hakos. וכיוון שאתה אפילו בכוס וצריך לחזור ולשלם, הרי הוא חוזר לחסידרן. So he explains, the Rashba explains like this. If you, so I'll start from the end and then go back to the middle. He explains with the Rosh's idea. Why is it that if you ate or did melacha before Havdalah, you have to repeat? So he says like this. If you're in the middle of if you're in the, let's say, if you're going through the system that you're supposed to dive in and say Havdalah, and then make Havdalah on the cup. So you missed one, beseder, you could make it up with the other. But if you've totally broken the system, you davened, and you say, okay, make Havdalah on the cup. I'm going to eat first. I'm going to do malacha first. Like, wait, you're outside the system. Just do the whole thing over. Right? That's what he says over here. כיוון שאתה אפילו בכוס, הוא צריך לחזור ולשלם ולהשלים, הרי הוא חוזר לחסידרן, right? Meaning, once you ate, we say, okay, repeat. Still make Havdalah on the kos. Yeah, but I didn't make Havdalah during davening either. It's like, okay, so why didn't you go back to there? So that's the idea here. Now, the interesting thing is, the Rosh mentions only eating. The Rashba says eating or doing melacha. Shulchan Aruch quotes the Meiri and the Rosh. Let's see what he says. He finishes his davening and doesn't have to repeat why. He's going to have to make Havdalah on the cup anyway, so you don't have to repeat the davening. If he ate before he made Havdalah, he'll have to repeat the davening again. And then he says the strange Meiri ta'a v'lo yivdil b'tfilah ve'en l'kos b'layla v'sover sha'af l'machar lo yeh lo tzarich l'chzor l'itpalel. If he'll have cup the following day when he finishes, he's a soldier, he's on shmirah. He can't make Havdalah now, but he can in the morning. So he could. So then he could just wait and make Havdalah then on the cup. But if he won't have the cup the following day either, he'll have to daven Ma'ariv again. Now, what we're saying is interesting is that the Shulchan Aruch knows the Rashba, and yet he only quotes the Rosh, right? Ta'am kodem she'ivdil, but he doesn't say, what about if he does melacha before he makes Havdalah? Right? He only mentions the Rosh's scenario where he ate before Havdalah. What about doing melacha before Havdalah? Rabbi Kiveger says, forget it. He said ta'am, if you ate before Havdalah, but if you ate or you did melacha, doesn't matter. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. That's not a difference. That's not. No nafkamina there. Eliarabba disagrees. Eliarabba says, שטעם עושה מלאכה קודם שהבדיל is what it says in the Rashba, but מה מבדיל אין צריך לחזור. So he points out something I mentioned earlier, and this is also going to open up what the nafkamina is going to be. There's a difference between the issue of eating before Havdalah and doing melacha before Havdalah. Doing melacha before Havdalah, if you're doing melacha, right, so Havdalah does two things. Havdalah is a mitzvah that's imposed on you. You have to do the mitzvah, and you're only allowed to eat after you do the mitzvah. As opposed to doing melacha before Havdalah, is the problem with that is that it's simply still Shabbos as far as you're concerned. Maybe objectively outside, right? It's night already. So outside, as far as the world is concerned, Shabbos is over. As far as you're concerned, Shabbos isn't over. You shouldn't do melacha. So the idea is like this: when we say you did a melacha before Havdalah, or you ate before Havdalah, what's the difference between eating before Havdalah and doing melacha before Havdalah? If you eat before Havdalah, that's a mistake in the halachot of Havdalah, because you have a mitzvah that you're supposed to do, and instead of doing it, you're eating. But if you do a melacha before Havdalah, it's not a mistake in Hilchot Havdalah, it's a mistake in Hilchot Shabbat. Right? It's true that had you made Havdalah, right, what we usually do is we say Havdalah during davening, and then we come home and we can light the Havdalah candle. How can you light the Havdalah candle? We haven't made Havdalah yet. Yes, we have. We made Havdalah during davening, right? That's the solution for that. But if you... Yes.
I have a question. I mean, we don't really say that for any other type of mitzvah. I know these examples may not be good ones, but I'm sure there's got to be one that's better. We forget to say something for Sukkot, or we don't eat in the Sukkah. We don't say, oh well, you don't have to repeat because you forget Yalav Yavo, or we don't say that you didn't light Hanukkah candles, or now you have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. Why is this different? What makes this different from where we do something completely different that's also inconsistent with the holiday, and that's going to affect our tefillah?
Okay, so I'm gonna leverage your question to help me explain this distinction that I was saying here between the Rashba says and the Rosh says. Now I'll try to answer. I'm not sure that my answer is good enough. I'm not sure, but I'll try to answer. To the best of my understanding. First of all, we learned last time that Havdalah is unique in that the mitzvah is the bracha, right? The bracha is the mitzvah, right? That's what we saw in the Magen Avraham there. Now again, we discussed and we raised the questions of how these distinctions work. Do they work? But I'm not going to go back to what we did last time. I'm going to focus on. I want to just use that for our purposes here. When you forgot to do this mitzvah that's based on speech, that's a unique situation, right? That's a unique situation. Chazal, basically, the way we look at it is like this. There's a mitzvah that you have to do. You have to do it by saying and pointing out the issue of the distinction. And we give you a few opportunities to do it. We tell you it's best to do it in these two opportunities. You should do it in this order. You have a few ways of doing it. If you mess that up, we tell you just repeat the whole mitzvah. Now, if you sit down in the sukkah and you forget to say Lashev B'Sukkah, right? Or you're benching and you forgot to say Ya'alev Yavo, right? So the mitzvah is the mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon. During Birkat HaMazon, you're supposed to mention Ya'alev Yavo. By the way, on Shabbos, in the two seudot that you have to make, in the two seudot in which, the first two seudot in which you have to wash, if you forget Ritzeh, we say the same thing, right? Since these are two seudot that you need to wash for, if you forget to say Ritzeh, you have to repeat the benching, because part of the Seudat Shabbat that you're mechuyav to have includes the benching that includes Ritzeh. And I think the same thing happens here. Sitting in the sukkah is the mitzvah itself. The bracha of Leshev B'Sukkah gives more kavanah to the mitzvah, gives more credence to the mitzvah, gives more seriousness to the mitzvah. but it's not the mitzvah itself. As opposed to Havdalah, that is the mitzvah. So we ask Chazal, okay, tell us how to do this mitzvah. Say, okay, here are your options. You can do it during davening, you can do it on the kos. You know what? Do it both. If you forget one, lo nora, do it on the other. But if you forgot one and then didn't take the other one seriously, we say just start over, which would be similar to Birkat HaMazon on Shabbos when we say Ritzeh. I won't be able to go into all the different scenarios and when do we not repeat things, but I hope that does give a bit more of a picture. I want to go back to here and use the same concept here. If I do a melacha like this, I come home. Let's say you forget. Now it's important to note it's a bit of an issue here. I go to shul. Not to shul Chalila. No, not to shul. I go out to the street. Right. I go out to the street and I daven Ma'ariv. Right. Not davening in shuls right now. I go out to the street and I daven Ma'ariv and I forget to say Atachonantan. I come home. I light the Havdalah candle. I say, wait a minute. As I'm lighting the Havdalah candle, I say, hold on. But I'm not allowed to light the Havdalah candle because I didn't say Havdalah yet. Right? No form of Havdalah yet. So the Rashba says, well, you messed up your whole Havdalah thing here because you started considering the time to be a chol time. Forget it. Start the whole thing over. Daven again. That's what the Rashba says. But some of the Biur Halacha says we hold like the Shulchan Aruch says, not like Reb Kiva, not like the Eliyah Rabbah. That's why the Eliyah Rabbah. The Eliyah Rabbah says we have a simple solution. Say Baruch Hamavdil B'Kodesh L'Chol. What is the difference? I think, to my understanding, when you say Baruch Hamavdil B'Kodesh L'Chol, what you did was you created the matir to do melacha, but that you didn't yet fulfill the mitzvah of Havdalah. That seems to be the distinction. You didn't yet fulfill the full mitzvah of Havdalah, not even the partial one, right? Or on the cost, right? But you did create a matir to do melacha. And that's why the melacha doesn't really get in the way of that, because those are two separate things. The Havdalah does two things, and I'll take this back to the uni part of what is Havdalah. Havdalah is two separate things. One is, Havdalah has two aspects. One aspect of Havdalah is the matir. It takes us out of the kedusha of Shabbos and allows us to start doing melacha again. Apart from that, it's also a mitzvah unto itself, be it the mitzvah of Zachor, the mitzvah of Ula Havdil, whatever mitzvah it is, as we learned last week, whatever mitzvah it is, it's a mitzvah that has to be done on Motzei Shabbat. Now, that's the difference between the eating and the doing melacha. The doing melacha isn't a problem in Havdalah. The doing melacha is a problem in Shabbos. Havdalah takes care of that aspect as well. But it's not. But by doing melacha, I'm not contradicting Havdalah. I just haven't finished Shabbos yet. Havdalah would have been a good way to end Shabbos. It's the way you're supposed to end Shabbos. But the problem is that But I wasn't not taking the mitzvah of Havdalah seriously. I didn't appreciate the need to let Shabbos out, the need of the matir. As opposed to eating was not taking the mitzvah seriously. And then you say, okay, there's just so far that you could go with not doing this mitzvah till we say, just do the whole thing again. Just do the whole thing over. And that's the difference. When we say you did melacha before Havdalah, what you did was you broke Shabbos, because it's still Shabbos, because you didn't bring that matir that allows you to end Shabbos. When you eat before Havdalah, what you're doing is you're not taking the mitzvah of Havdalah seriously, so we tell you do it again. So I'd say, just to sum up, 3 opinions just about that point. Opinion number 1 is the Rashba, who says there's no difference, it's the same thing, eating or doing melacha, and that seems to be what the Kiveger says. Eliyah Rabbah says there is a difference. If you do melacha before Havdalah, if you come home from davening, you forgot to say Atachonantan, now you're stuck. Because either you could let your 5-year-old light the Havdalah candle, which is probably not a good idea, or you could daven again, right? Because you're going to have to break Shabbos. right? I come back from davening. I didn't say atachon antanu. I come back home. I say I don't have to repeat atachon antanu. I say wait, I have to do melacha before I can't make Havdalah till I do this melacha of lighting the candle. What do I do? So we say, okay, you could say Baruch HaMavdil, and then you have the matir part, but that's not taking the mitzvah of Havdalah seriously. As opposed to if you eat, there's no way out of that. And the Biur Halacha says, Be'emet, not to worry if you came home. This is an important thing. If you came home and you came home, you forgot to say Atachon Antanu, you come home and you light the Havdalah candle, and then you remember that you didn't say Atachon Antanu during davening, says the Biur Halacha that you don't have to worry about the Rashba. You could samech on the Rosh and the Meiri. There's another Biur Halacha here that I don't remember why I didn't put on the page, but it's just an important thing to add to this very point. What happens if I'm going to send this on the chat.
Sorry, are you going on to the next point? Can I ask on this?
It's not really the next point. It's really part of this point. I'm going to send Birshutchem on the chat. I just realized when I was looking over the notes before, I realized this isn't on the page. But it's quite an important Biur Halacha. Do you see it on the chat? I'm sorry I'm doing it like this. I try to put everything on the page. The Biur Halacha asks the following question. I mean, it's really Pri Megadim's question. What happens if I come home? No, let's just read it. אפשר דווקא, אם לא הבדיל עדיין על הכוס, ובלפנינו לשאול, אז הדין יחזור ויבדיל בתפילה, ואחר כך על הכוס. אבל אם עבר והבדיל על הכוס, אחר שטעם, שוב אין צריך לחזור להבדיל בתפילה, כיוון שמכל מקום כבר יצא מצוות הבדלה. The question is this. A person comes home, let's do the simple one, say 8. Forget the did melacha, because that yesh al mi lismoch, etc. A person eats before comes home from shul. He's very thirsty, a big cup of water, prepares for Havdalah, stops and says, oh wait, I didn't say Atachon Antanu and I ate. What should I do? Not sure. Tov. You know, the wife, the kids are like, come on, do Havdalah. He says, fine, do Havdalah, do not go ask. Does Havdalah. Does he now need to repeat davening? Is there two ways of looking at this, right? One way of looking at this is, as soon as you ate, we told you, now you have to daven again, which means we disqualified your Ma'ariv. If we disqualified your Ma'ariv, we said, okay, then you have Havdalah on the cross, but you still haven't davened Ma'ariv. I think that's what Derech HaChaim is saying. Derech HaChaim Satam Dein Chiluk B'zeh. He says, it doesn't matter if you ask before or ask after. Why? Because once you eat after Ma'ariv, without having said Atachon Antanu, that makes us disqualify your Ma'ariv. You haven't davened Ma'ariv yet, so you have to daven Ma'ariv. That's what Derech HaChaim says. Pri Megadim isn't so sure. Why not? Because he says, it's not that you haven't davened Ma'ariv. It's that you haven't said Atachon Antanu. Now, we imposed the knas on you, saying if you messed up your Havdalah so much, just repeat everything. But then you did the greater Havdalah, which is the Havdalah on the kos. So Havdalah's over. The mitzvah's over. There's no way. Why should you daven again? You daven Ma'ariv, and you did the full mitzvah of Havdalah by doing it on the cup. So what? I'd say the full. What justification is there to daven Ma'ariv again now? If you haven't done Havdalah yet, and you say, well, we're not allowing you to do Havdalah on the kos yet until you daven Ma'ariv. You say, okay, that justifies davening again. But if you already made Havdalah on the cup, there's no justification to now daven Ma'ariv again, because Ma'ariv you davened, and you davened Ma'ariv, and you made Havdalah, so what's missing? Right? That's the way the Pri Megadim is reading it, as opposed to Derech Chaim says, no, when you ate before Havdalah, we disqualified your Ma'ariv. We said, when you davened Ma'ariv and you skipped Atachon Antanu, we're going to allow you to get away with it, contingent on your doing Havdalah properly right away. If not, as we view it as, and just want to go back to the Gemara that is based on, as we said before, the Gemara over here says, Mipnei she'omra ala kos. Lama ein machzirin oto? Why don't we make you repeat? Mipnei she'omra ala kos. since you do it properly, if you don't do it properly, so ken machzirin oto. And then as far as we're concerned, you haven't davened ma'ariv. And that's, I think, it's machlok pri megadim. Derech HaChaim, how do we view this concept of ta'abazo vazeh? Ta'abazo vazo, are we saying ein machzirin oto because you could still do it properly, but once you did it improperly, you haven't davened ma'ariv? Or do we say it's a knas that requires you to do the full Havdalah again? Once you did Havdalah, you're done.